Welcome to Topics. I'm Phil Gallagher, and this is actually my 40th anniversary show, my 40th year as a volunteer in local access programming. And I'm very pleased to have as my guest today Dan Kennedy, who has appeared in every decade of those 4 decades and is now making an appearance in the 5th decade. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Dan is a graduate of Northeastern with a BA in journalism and a master's in liberal arts from Boston
American
University.
history.
Oh, American history. Okay, American history. And Boston Massacre was his thesis, I believe.
It was on press coverage of the Boston Massacre. So I've been doing this for a long time.
Well, I was just going to mention it's 43 years since your graduation.
Yep.
And Dan's no stranger to this region, actually. He spent 9 years at the Woburn Times Chronicle. He also spent time at Metro West Magazine, North Shore Magazine, the Pilot.
The Pilot,
The
yes.
Pilot. And is now a professor of journalism at Northeastern University. He also spent 13 years on Beat the Press with 2 of my favorite other great journalists, John Keller and Emily Rooney. And he's now both blogging at MediaNation.net.
DanKennedy.net.
But MediaNation is the name of the...
Yes, MediaNation is the name of the blog.
Okay.
MediaNation.com wasn't available.
Okay. And he's also podcasting with Emily and John Keller, Emily Rooney and John Keller, and also does WBUR gig with, or is it GBH gig? No, independent gig with Emily, with Clegg.
It's independent. We have a podcast called What Works.
What Works.
And we look at the future of local news.
Okay, and what is Clegg's first name?
Ellen Clegg.
Ellen Clegg, great.
Yes.
Okay, all right, so we've done all of those.
We recorded that just before I came over here, actually. And I just want to add, you left out the Boston Phoenix, which was the longest stop of my career.
That's right, that's right.
The late lamented Boston Phoenix.
And you also write for The Guardian and Neiman and a few others.
Yep.
How does the Pilot fit in with the Phoenix and the Guardian?
I went directly from the Pilot to the Phoenix,
Yeah,
so that was
right.
an interesting transition.
It sure was. It sure was. Well, let's start right away with the state of journalism. Who's coming to your classes these days? Are these objective people, or are they already indoctrinated into their ideological view in terms of how they report and what journalism they do?
Well, we have a number of different types of students who come to us and a number of different interests. So we certainly have a fair number of students who come in and want to do traditional journalism. I say traditional in terms of the ethics of it. Right. Obviously,
the objectivity,
the tools and the orientation is different from what it was when I was coming up. But we also have public relations, we have media advocacy, which is aimed at students who might want to work for a nonprofit or political campaigns or that sort of thing. So when you talk about students who are interested in doing objective journalism, that's really just one of the things we offer now. Mm-hmm. And we also have a number of students who are doing data journalism, which I'm not smart enough, they don't let me teach that. But I know that one of our best students who graduated just recently is going off to be a data reporter for USA Today, which is just terrific. And I think it speaks to the kinds of jobs that our graduates are getting.
Well, can you even tell us what data reporting is?
Oh, boy.
Is that statistic work?
It's a lot of it's statistics. Right. A lot of it is taking data sets and making sense of them, doing data visualization so that you can, when you read a story on your iPad or your computer or whatever, you'll see some nice presentation of the data that makes sense in a visual way, and maybe you can interact with it.
And corresponding with polling?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, that's been a really big development for us. We've moved into data journalism in a very big way in the last few years. I'll tell you something. I was actually involved some years ago in coming up with a new combined major of journalism and computer science. Mm-hmm. And for years, we would tell our incoming students, if you like math, you ought to consider this because there are jobs. And they would all look at me like I was crazy and say, why do you think I went into journalism? I hate math. Right. And then the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a complete turnaround. And now we get a lot of students who are going into that area.
Well, that's primarily because the traditional sense of journalism is disappearing, is it not? The print media. Tell us what's happening in the print media in terms of the transition. Is there jobs there? Is the the overall pool of journalism diminished greatly as a result of this transition?
Well, here we are in eastern Massachusetts, where we have just experienced a massacre. Gannett, which is the largest newspaper chain in the country, recently closed 19 weekly papers serving 26 communities, I think. One of them was the Burlington Union. They've also merged a number of other papers. Now, they say it's okay because we're offering it online, and that is a logical thing for them to say, but it's not true. Because at the same time, they took almost all of their local reporters and reassigned them to regional beats. I published an internal memo that I got on my blog in which a Gannett executive basically said people don't care about local news anymore, which I don't think is true at all. But at the same time, we have dozens and dozens and dozens of independent local news outlets in Massachusetts. And I think that's only going to grow as chains like Gannett pull back. So, yeah, the scene is somewhat smaller than it was, but I'm very optimistic about what the future's
what about the
gonna
monetization? And let's go back. When I first met you in the old days, when we were young, and I had hair,
We're both pretty gray, Phil.
Yeah, what's left? At that time, you were working at the Daily Times Chronicle. We had the Burlington Times, we had the Union, and we had another weekly, which escapes me at the moment. And so we had, you had a couple of full-time guys, 3 or 4 of them, I believe, covering Woburn and Burlington and Stoneham.
Yep.
We had full-timers, editors at the Times Union, at the Union and the Times. No, it was the Times and the News, and they became the Times Union because the two of them got together. And then we had 9 paid stringers that were covering meetings and digging up new stories. Now today, it appears we have 1 part-timer that covers from the Times Chronicle, and who knows, it's been a merry-go-round on the other weeklies. How do you monetize local news to fill in the gaps that type of manpower was taking care of?
Well, the advertising model for local news is not what it used to be, that's for sure. Craigslist, Google, and Facebook have taken away a lot of that. And what's left for the for-profit sector is essentially selling digital subscriptions. And we've seen some of the larger papers do very well with that. Certainly at the national level, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal are doing incredibly well selling digital subscriptions. More regionally, the Boston Globe has done quite well with that. But it's only now starting to trickle down to the local level. And at this point in our evolution, and this may change, but right now, I think the most successful model for local journalism is nonprofit. And you have nonprofit news websites raising money from foundations, local philanthropists, voluntary memberships in many cases. That can be very successful.
And subsidized through the cable contracts like our nonprofit here in BCAT.
Well, certainly local cable can be a big part of solving the local news crisis, but most local access operations don't do news directly. BCAT is unusual in the degree of local news that they provide. But I definitely think that as we think about where we're going, local access cable could become a larger and larger part of that.
Now, you mentioned the nationals, but they've been stripped down in the newsroom to a large degree, have they not?
Not the nationals. The New York Times and the Washington Post, and to a lesser extent the Wall Street Journal, because they've had a pretty successful paid digital model all along. But the Times and the Post, they did quite a bit of shrinkage at one point, found their legs, started building back up with digital subscriptions, and they're now as big as they've ever been in their history. The New York Times right now has a newsroom with 1,700 full-time people in it, which is the largest newsroom in their history. The Washington Post, I think they're around 1,000. So they're actually doing very well, but they're able to take advantage of the economies of scale. The New York Times has something like 7 million digital subscribers. The Washington Post, 3 million. The Boston Globe can't do that because their area of interest is, restricted to the greater Boston area.
With the total, the state is only itself 7 million people, right?
Exactly. And certainly at the hyper-local level, you're dealing with a much smaller range of people. So I think that's one of the reasons why digital subscriptions at the local level can be a hard sell. But as I said, volunteer memberships at the local level are doing very well. And so I think that unfortunately, what you have is a situation where you can have a community that's extremely well served right next door to a community that has nothing. And that's the inequity that we need to try to figure out how to make up for.
Okay, you've also been busy with your writing. You've got a couple. Little People was a book, essentially a narrative and kind of a journal of your own experience with your daughter and
Yes.
in an examination of dwarfism. But you also had a couple of media books, The Oligarchs. Is it The Return of the Oligarchs?
The Return of the Moguls.
Return of the Moguls, okay. And what was the other one? Was
The Wired City.
Wired City, okay, which were both media driven.
Yes.
Talk about The Return of the Oligarchs. Is it good that we have Jeff Bezos and John Henry, for instance, controlling and the family, the New York Times family, which escapes me, but they've been there for 100
The
years.
Sulzbergers.
The
yes.
Sulzbergers, yes. The Return of the Moguls, what is the essence of that study?
Well, The Return of the Moguls was essentially a look at three wealthy newspaper owners and whether they were charting a way for the future. Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, John Henry at the Boston Globe, and somebody I wrote about quite a bit, but he didn't make the title because he failed. Aaron Kushner, who owned the Orange County Register in Southern California for a while. And so I was looking at the different ways that they were reinventing what they were doing. And as I said, Aaron Kushner fell short. He put way too much money into the Orange County Register too quickly, couldn't absorb it, and hit the wall. And unlike Jeff Bezos and John Henry, Aaron Kushner was merely wealthy. He didn't have this unimaginable billions that Bezos and Henry have.
Merely wealthy, yeah,
Yes.
that's good.
And Bezos ended up reinventing the Post by turning it into a national digital news organization with a heavy emphasis on technology, heavy emphasis on digital subscriptions. He integrated it with Amazon in some interesting ways, even though the Post is not directly part of Amazon. And what John Henry ended up doing with the Globe, and I have to say that this strategy was just starting to come into focus when the book came out, is he said, we're going to charge as much as the market will bear. So the Globe charges $30 a month for a digital subscription, which is more than just about any newspaper in the country. And if you want 7-day print, it's extremely expensive.
Yeah, I think it's $5.50 for the Sunday now, which is
I
a mere
think,
shadow of its former self.
right, although there's a lot of content. It's the ads that are missing. You remember, they used to have so many classifieds, you'd need to have two people bring in the Sunday Globe from the front
I delivered
step.
60 Sundays
Ooh.
a week, so I can tell you.
And
yes.
the Globe is doing very well. They got down to as few as about 220 full-time people in the newsroom. They're back up to 250. They keep expanding. They're profitable. It's privately held, so you have to take their word for it. But they say they're profitable. It seems to be a success story.
Now, inject Musk into this media as an oligarch, a mogul in the media business. What do you see? First of all, what is your reaction to his attempt to buy Twitter, and what do you think the ramifications are?
Well, I think it's a very complicated story because my first reaction was Elon Musk is going to destroy Twitter. My second reaction was, but Twitter is already terrible. Unfortunately, what Musk has said about what he wants to do with Twitter, I think would take a service that already has enormous problems with disinformation, with people attacking each other, and all of that, and making it worse. Now, as we're speaking today, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that Musk doesn't want Twitter and is trying to figure out a way to get out of buying it. I think it's ultimately, if he ended up buying it, it's going to do tremendous damage to his business with Tesla. I mean, he's quite dependent on the Chinese for Tesla. And if he buys Twitter, guess who's going to tell him what's going to be on Twitter and what isn't going to be on Twitter? It's going to be the Chinese government.
Well, aren't you free? Well, that could be said for a lot of industries in the United States.
Yeah, but
and
they're
a lot
not
of politicians.
But they're not controlling major media outlets.
Right. You're a free speech absolutist.
Almost.
Almost. Okay. This is really no different than the days of Benjamin Franklin and his almanac, in terms of what was said in the town square and who was defamed and smeared, etc. Really, this is just into the 21st century, is it not? It's the same thing.
Well, he can do what he wants with it, of course, if he buys it.
But I mean the participants.
And the users can do what they want.
Exactly.
And I think that if it became even more toxic than it already is, I think that what the users are going to do is walk out in large numbers. It's pretty bad already.
Well, that's different than being thrown out because you have a differing opinion than what the nannies have. In this disinformation scheme, who is the arbiter of what disinformation is? I mean, opinion frequently is disinformation.
Sure.
Everybody's entitled to their opinion, regardless whether it's factual or lacking a little bit of fact or a lot of fact, etc. So, I mean, how realistically, there is already laws on the books relative to defamation.
Sure.
And you can't yell fire in a theater, which I think is, the
unless there's a fire. I mean, and then you can yell fire.
Well, you can't yell fire even if there isn't a fire in a theater.
You can't yell fire if there is no fire.
That's right.
This is true.
That's right. So you can't really yell fire on Twitter or
Right.
Facebook if there's no fire. But
Right.
who determines, who's to be the ultimate arbiter of these things as we go along into the disinformation debate?
Well, these are private companies. The people who own them will be the arbiter. And they're not just thinking about the First Amendment. Actually, I don't know that they really they're worried about the First Amendment at all. They're thinking about their brand, their reputation, how many people they can attract, how long they can keep them on the site, and how much advertising they can sell to them. These are all concerns that have very little to do with free speech.
Well, it does, but then in terms of a strategic decision, kicking a former president of the United States off of the platform couldn't have been a very wise business decision, and ultimately is what's brought Twitter to its knees, or will shortly, don't you think?
How do you figure? I mean, their number of users didn't go down after.
Well, we're going to determine what their number of users are because
I'm not saying that they should have thrown Trump off permanently. I think that that's a separate discussion, but I don't see how it hurt them.
Well, it's hurt them to a large degree because of how they, the ideological decisions that they make about who gets kicked off. You don't see Antifa and BLM and all the left-wing groups being kicked off.
Right.
But if you're a right-winger, you know, suddenly it's disinformation.
Well, I think we're talking about two different things. Twitter was a mediocre business when Trump was on it, and it's a mediocre business today. That's why it was ripe for being taken over by Elon Musk.
Okay, but it was selling at $50 a share and making money.
It's never been very profitable.
Okay.
You compare it to Facebook. First of all, it's exponentially smaller than Facebook.
Right.
And Facebook mints money.
Right.
Twitter's never made much money.
Well, but Facebook is likely to suffer the same problem going forward with this. Who gets to speak? Who gets, you know, kicked off for a period of time, or who's banned forever? I mean, how long can this go on before there are some major repercussions in terms of free speech advocates?
Well, again, it's what kind of a conversation you want to encourage to keep people on the site buying products. That's ultimately what it's all about. If you want to talk about freedom of speech, and I'm always up for a good freedom of speech discussion, you really need to be looking at what the government is doing, because that's what the freedom, what the First Amendment controls.
That brings me to the next question about this Ministry of Truth, or the disinformation
Which is gone
board.
now.
Well, supposedly it's gone. Now, Janikowski, what's her name?
I don't know.
Janikowski, yeah. She has resigned, but the word out this morning was that they've only put it, Mayorkas has only put it on hold. And, you know, my central question to you is, what is the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, being involved in this type of a situation to begin with? It's hardly within their charter, don't you think?
Well, I think that they see it as within their charter because they are concerned about disinformation leading to, you know, possible terrorist attacks, such as what we just experienced in Buffalo. You know, we had a good discussion about this recently on the Beat the Press podcast, in fact, and I think where we came down, and I think you would approve, Phil, is the government doesn't need to be involved in this. There are state-of-the-art academic institutions, such as the Harvard Kennedy School, that study disinformation and regularly put out really good reports explaining where it's coming from, what it is, what we might be able to do about it. There's really no need for the government to try to duplicate that effort. And as soon as you have the government trying to get involved in something like that, you have the kind of concerns that you're raising. So leave it to the expert researchers that are already working on this topic.
Well, the interesting thing is the primary purveyor of disinformation is government for the most part, between, you know, the White House and the Congress and the Senate. I mean, on both sides of the aisle, you can never believe what they're saying. But let's talk about the experts for a second and talk about the New York Times, who essentially, you know, when the New York Post broke the Hunter Biden story, the 50 members of the intelligence community and the New York Times, they refused to run the story. They all agreed, as did the Washington Post, all agreed that this was Russian disinformation. And it wasn't until almost 2 years later that they owned up to the fact that it was a legitimate story and should have been covered from the beginning, which brings up the question, did their newsrooms decide to do this so that they wanted to affect the election?
Oh, you need to do some research on this one, Phil.
Okay, I'm willing to listen.
First of all, the laptop has not been verified. It's never been found. They did find what was purported to be a copy of the hard drive, but it appeared to have been tampered with. So let's just start with that.
Oh, but the FBI picked up the drive
but
13 months.
But let's go back to the golden days of yesteryear, shall we?
Okay.
This story was shopped to the news division at Fox News. They said, we're not going to touch this. There's no evidence for it. We need to have some evidence before we report it. So then it was shopped to the New York Post, which did break the story. reporters at the New York Post, this ended up being written by editors at the Post. Reporters at the Post refused to have their byline put on it because they said, we can't verify this, we can't vouch for it. And finally, they slapped on the byline of a woman who'd had very little to do with the story, just so that they could have a byline on it. Mm-hmm. And so then out the story comes. Now, we have since learned that there was more to the story than we might have thought at the time, although it's not fair to say that it's been verified. It really hasn't been.
Well, it is fair to say.
But there are times when you have a story that's completely unverified, so you don't touch it, and then we find out later that there was something to it as more reporting takes place. It doesn't mean that you go back to say, oh, well, we made a mistake in not running it back when there was no evidence for it.
Well, Miranda Grimes, I believe, is the one you're talking about they slapped the byline on. She has written the book, The Laptop from Hell, in which she has verified emails. They have verified photos of Hunter Biden from the laptop, snorting coke and smoking crack, etc. But 2 years afterwards, to finally admit that there was some substance to the story.
Well, the Washington Post put months of reporting into it before they said there may have been something to it. It takes time. It takes work. We're talking about journalism. We're not talking about going on cable news and just saying anything you want.
Well, let's compare the Times effort with the recent effort in investigating 9 journalists investigating all of, what's his name, Tucker Carlson's programs to determine whether or not he's a racist, and apparently came up with that conclusion that Tucker Carlson is a racist.
All they had to do was watch once.
Well, you really believe that? You really believe that Tucker Carlson is a racist?
I think he is one of the most racist people in the country. You know, I had lunch with Tucker Carlson many years ago. He used to be a normal conservative, and he was somebody I would check in with a couple of times a year to, you know, just talking about stories, very charming. And he, you know, he has just turned into something unrecognizable, a racist, a friend of Putin. I mean, this is not something you have to report. He says it every night. But I thought that the Times did do an interesting job of pulling all this together.
Let's agree to disagree on that. But last, we only
What's
have a minute.
What's to disagree with, Phil?
Well, anybody that says all lives matter, or anybody doesn't agree with CRT, or anybody brings up the subject of black on black murder, is called a racist. I mean, let's face it, that's the left's calling card. You're transphobic, you're Islamophobic, you're racist if you disagree with anything on the left's agenda. So
Tucker Carlson goes way beyond that, and you know it.
Well, those are partly the reasons. But one last question before we go. How do the Democrats fare in the midterms, and is Biden reelectable, or is he indeed going to be the candidate in 2024?
I think that, you know, obviously it's shaping up as a very, very tough midterm for the Democrats. You would imagine that the Republicans will take back the House and the Senate.
As is likely to happen in many years previously.
As was likely to happen many years previously. I think that what the Democrats have going for them is the forthcoming Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade, and some of the candidates, the extreme candidates that the Republicans are nominating for office, with this guy in Pennsylvania being for governor, I should say, Doug Mastriano, I believe his name is, being a prime example of that. But it's still going to be really difficult for the Democrats. There's no question about it. Will Biden run again? He says he will. He's really getting up there. Yeah. And you have to wonder if he might decide to hand that off. Mm-hmm. He seems to be vigorous enough, but...
Do you really think his cognitive skills are worthy of the leader of the free world?
I don't see any difference between him now and 30 years ago. He's always said goofy
Stupid
things, so I don't know that that's really changed.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that note. So let's leave it at that. Again, I want to thank our guest, Dan Kennedy. Let's hope we make a 6th decade together, Dan.
Absolutely, I'm up for it. 2032, man.
Absolutely. I'm Phil Gallagher. My guest has been Dan Kennedy, professor of journalism at Northeastern University and man about town in a variety of different other areas. Thank you for joining us.